The winter wind moaned like a living thing through the stone corridors of the Grand Albion Hotel. Perched high above the slate-gray Thames, snow drifted against the mullioned windows, muting the world beyond in a blanket of chill and silence. Inside, the air was warm, scented faintly of beeswax and coal smoke. The porter's boots clacked across the marble tiles as he ascended the north wing. With a frown etched deep into his forehead, something was wrong with room 17. He rapped once. Twice no answer. It wasn't unusual. Guests overslept or ignored. Knocks often enough, but the maid had tried an hour before, and again just minutes ago. And the do not disturb sign had been hanging on the knob since the previous evening. That was against protocol. Guests were not permitted to remain uninterrupted for more than 12 hours without checking in with the front desk. He knocked a final time, then inserted the master key. The room was dark, curtains drawn, fireplace unlit, but the temperature was not cold. In fact, the air was oddly warm, almost stifling. The gas heater by the wall ticked faintly. He stepped, incautiously and stopped. Lying on the plush carpet beside the writing desk was a man, early 50s, well-dressed to well-dressed, in fact, for a man traveling alone. His dinner jacket was perfectly tailored, his hair still combed with care, but his eyes stared up at the ceiling, glassy and fixed. The color had drained from his face, lips tinged blue. He was dead. The porter retreated in a stumbling daze. The manager was summoned, and within half an hour, so was the police. But before the uniformed men had completed their preliminary examination, someone had already picked up the telephone in the lobby and asked for Lord Peter Wimsey. He arrived in under an hour, fur-collared coat dusted with snow, monocle glinting in the electric light. The detective surveyed the scene with the composed curiosity of a man attending a particularly intriguing art exhibit. His keen eye took in the man's body, the untouched room service tray near the window, the sealed windows, and the distinct lack of any signs of struggle. Name, Wimsey inquired. Mr. Archibald Prentice, said Inspector Parker, who had also been called in for the case. Widowed, traveling from Leamington Spa. Checked in last night, dined alone, requested no disturbance. That's all we know. Wimsey crouched near the body, pulling a pair of fine gloves over his hands. He examined the man's collar, then the writing desk, which had a pad of notepaper, unused. The inkwell had dried at the edges, but no letter, no note. Suicide, Parker suggested. Possible, Wimsey murmured, but unlikely. Too little drama. No gas tap open, no bottle, no blade, no bullet. And note the position of the body on his side, as if placed there. A bit tidy for someone in the throes of death, don't you think? The medical examiner confirmed it. Cause of death was poison. Cyanide, most likely. Given the smell, though, it had only lingered faintly. Death would have been swift, but no container, no glass, no syringe. Nothing obvious had been left behind. The room was sealed, windows locked from the inside, door bolted when the porter arrived. No footprints in the snow on the narrow balcony outside. Then came the oddest clue. In the man's pocket was a single playing card, the Queen of Spades folded, once down the middle, as though it had been handled often. No wallet, no money, just the card, a key to the room, and a handkerchief embroidered with the initials EHP. Asked Parker. Not Archibald Prentice, said Wimsey. Could be a red herring, or the truth in disguise. More curious still, the hotel register had been signed with a flourishing hand, A. Prentice, Esquire, but no identification beyond that. When they attempted to trace his origins, there was no Archibald Prentice known to have lived in Leamington Spa, nor anywhere else. It's beginning to smell, Wimsey said to Mornings later, still deep in thought as he stared at the chessboard. In his study, a man checks in under a false name, dies within 12 hours, leaves no apparent motive, and carries a playing card that suggests, what? A calling card. A warning. Parker had unearthed more details from the hotel staff. The maid had entered earlier that evening to stoke the fire, and claimed the gentleman had been perfectly pleasant, tasked her to leave the lamp on, and fresh towels on the bed. No one else had visited him, according to the desk clerk, but a chambermaid, Rosie, whispered that she'd seen a woman in a dark fur coat standing outside room 17 shortly after midnight. She hadn't reported it then. It wasn't her business after all, but it was unusual. Whimsy latched onto the detail. The security staff swore no one had gone in or out, and yet Rosie was insistent. The woman had stood outside for several minutes, her gloved hand resting on the door handle, before walking silently down the hall. There had been something haunting about her posture, she said, something as if she already knew what was inside. Whimsy, intrigued, asked to examine the guest list for the previous evening. One room caught his eye, room 21, just a few doors down. Registered to a Mrs. Eleanor H. Penmark. The initials matched the handkerchief, Penmark. That name rang a bell. He recalled an incident some years back involving a court case, financial fraud, a ruined family fortune, and a man named Elgin Penmark who had committed suicide in disgrace. His wife had vanished from public view shortly thereafter. Could it be? When they visited room 21, it was empty, vacated early that morning, paid in cash. No forwarding address. The woman had used a false name. Perhaps, but the initials were no coincidence. And then Whimsy made the connection. What if our dead man wasn't Archibald Prentice at all? He asked. What if he was, let us say, Edgar Penmark, brother, perhaps, of the late Elgin? Or worse, his betrayer? A search of bank records and shipping manifests yielded results. Edgar Penmark had indeed lived in Calais under an alias for several years, after being implicated but never charged in the financial ruin of his own brother. So the wife returns to England, Whimsy murmured, tracks him to this hotel, confirms his identity, and ensures he drinks something lethal, cyanide in a brandy flask, perhaps. Offered as a peace gesture, she watches the door afterward, maybe overcome by guilt, or simply making sure the job is done. Then she vanishes. But how had she administered the poison? Whimsy had one final theory, and when the coroner re-examined the scene, it was confirmed. Faint traces of cyanide in the stopper of the man's personal cologne bottle. Not enough to poison by smell, but enough that, when applied to lips or fingertips, then touched to the mouth, a kiss goodbye, Whimsy said grimly. Elegant, intimate, and fatal. The police never found Eleanor H. Penmark. She had slipped into the fog of London, as silent and invisible as she had come. But Lord Peter Whimsy, gazing thoughtfully at the folded Queen of Spades still lying in his palm, suspected she would never resurface, for justice, in her mind, had already been served. Lord Peter Whimsy leaned back in the armchair of room 17, legs crossed, his gaze fixed on the cologne bottle now resting in a small evidence bag on the writing desk. The faint scent of bitter almonds still clung to the room, a ghost of death lurking beneath the perfumes and pipe tobacco. Outside the window, snow slid gently down the pane, streaking the glass with slow, white trails. Inside, the warmth felt to still. He stood and wandered the room once more, retracing steps not his own, his gloved fingers grazing surfaces already examined by police hands. Yet, he was looking not for the obvious but for the overlooked. There was always something, a criminal's haste, a misjudged detail, an unguarded moment. It was never in what they concealed, but in what they failed to see as visible. At the corner of the hearth, tucked between the skirting board and a slipper chair, his eye caught the faintest glint of silver. He bent, plucked it up, a hatpin, ornate, black enamel with a pearl bead at the top, the kind once popular in the Edwardian era. Hardly fashionable now, most likely antique. Too large to be worn discreetly, meant more for defense or style than practicality. Whimsy turned it between his fingers, thoughtful. The police had missed it. Easy to do when a murder scene offers no struggle, no chaos. But this pin was too fine to be dismissed as accidental. It belonged to someone with taste and confidence, someone who had visited this room and left something behind. He did not mention the pin to Parker just yet. Instead, he asked to speak again with the chambermaid, Rosie, who had seen the mysterious woman in the fur coat. She was nervous, fidgeting with the hem of her apron as she sat across from Whimsy in the small lounge by the hotel's service corridor. She was tall, sir, Rosie repeated, but not very. Just taller than me, and I'm 5'3". Pale, dark hair pulled back, and her coat had a kind of feather trim. I thought it looked out for this weather, but it was elegant. Did she speak to you? Rosie shook her head. She didn't even look at me, sir. Just stood there, not knocking or listening. Just like she was thinking very hard. Did you notice her hands? Rosie blinked. Gloved, long black gloves, tight ones. Why, no reason, Whimsy said lightly. And her shoes, oh, now, those were something. Black leather, little buttons down the side. Looked like something from years ago. Fancy. Not the sort you'd wear if you meant to do much walking. Thank you, Rosie. You've been most helpful. Don't worry, your memory's better than most. She blushed and excused herself, and Whimsy turned back toward the lift. The pieces were beginning to press against one another. A woman, elegant but anachronistic, moves silently through the corridors. She leaves behind a hatpin too specific to ignore as she vanishes before morning. He returned to Parker, who was overseeing a second sweep of room 21. You've done well, Whimsy said mildly, but might I have a word with the housekeeper? The housekeeper, indeed. I've a theory that's rather domestic in nature. Mrs. Danbury was summoned, a precise woman of middle years with an iron spine and a loathing for scandal. She offered her statements crisply. Room 21 had been left in proper condition, nothing broken or misplaced, and the linens were returned as usual to the laundry. And the laundry, Whimsy prompted. You mean the hotel's service? Yes. Everything goes to Heskin's linen services on Tuesdays and Fridays. Whimsy looked at the calendar. Friday, would the garments be marked? Of course, tags with initials, per regulation. Within the hour, Whimsy and Parker stood inside the steaming facility of Heskin's laundry. Among white sheets and hissing presses, the supervisor was obliging. A separate batch had indeed come from room 21 that morning. Pillowcases, towels, and one bathrobe. Folded within the bathrobe's pocket was a small slip of pale blue notepaper. It bore the letterhead of the Grand Albion Hotel and a single line of writing in a graceful, slanted hand. He will not leave this place alive. No signature. Just the faint scent of perfume on the paper. Jasmine, perhaps, mingled with something. Earthy orris root. Parker swore under his breath. Whimsy said nothing, merely holding the note to the light before slipping it into an envelope. She wrote this in advance. He murmured at last, not in panic, not on impulse. She came, here knowing what she intended. Back at the hotel, he resumed his quiet circuit of the scene. The police had long since concluded their sweep, but Whimsy took time to sit again at the writing desk in room 17. The pad of paper remained as before, but he reached beneath it, fingers running along the blotter underneath, and there it was, a ghost of a phrase. He retrieved a sheet of thin paper from his pocket and lightly shaded it with a pencil. Over the blotter's surface, a few scattered words appeared most faint, some overlapping, but one line was clearer than the rest. You are always cruelest when kind. A peculiar phrase. It felt like the echo of a letter unsent. Something written, perhaps, then discarded, or copied from elsewhere. Parker leaned in to read, frowning. You think he wrote that? Possibly. But I think not. The hand matches the note from the bathrobe. This was her writing again. She wrote here, perhaps hesitating, perhaps testing the words she could not speak aloud. Romantic motive, no. Revenge, the kind born from silence. What interests me is that she left nothing that identified her except one. He withdrew the hatpin. She was not sloppy. This is too deliberate. Left where only someone observant might find it. She is inviting something, or perhaps daring us. Who the devil is she really? Parker asked. That, Whimsy said softly, is the next thing we must discover, and I have a notion where to start. He turned to the telephone and dialed the British Museum's Special Collections Archive. I need a record, he told the attendant, of any woman last known to be in possession of a mourning pin with a black enamel crown, and freshwater pearl, possibly part of a matched set given during Edward VII's funeral era. Oh, and do look under the Penmark family holdings. There may be something rather theatrical hidden among the tragedies. It was just past 6 o'clock that evening when Lord Peter Whimsy returned to the Grand Albion. The gas lamps outside flickered against the encroaching dark, and the snow, softened now into a fine slush, painted the pavements in dull streaks of gray. Inside, The lobby had regained its usual composure, the initial shock of the morning's discovery absorbed by the comforting rhythm of fresh guests, clinking cutlery from the dining hall, and the bellhop's courteous nods. But the echo of death lingered in room 17, and the scent of deception still drifted faintly through the corridors. Whimsy moved with quiet purpose. He had asked Parker to assemble all relevant staff and guests who might have come into contact with the deceased or the mysterious woman in room 21. He did not expect confessions. He expected omissions. They began with Mr. Hargreaves, the night manager, a stiff-collared man with a fondness for rules and a tendency to over-explain. He recounted the previous night's events. With rehearsed precision, Mr. Prentice had checked in shortly before 8, declined assistance with his luggage, and requested no disturbances. He had not been seen afterward. And the woman in room 21, Whimsy asked. Hargreaves hesitated. She registered under the name Mrs. Eleanor Penmark. He said, but I had my doubts. Doubts? She seemed to composed, not evasive, exactly, but guarded, as though she expected questions, but was prepared for them. Paid in cash, no luggage, just a small leather valise. Said she'd only be staying one night. I thought she might be running from something. Yet you said nothing. Hargreaves flushed. I've worked this hotel 23 years, my lord. One learns discretion. Guests carry burdens. It's not our place to pry. Whimsy nodded, almost approvingly. Did you see her after check-in? No. But the lift operator, Tom, mentioned she returned to her room after 11. He offered to carry something for her, but she refused when Tom was brought in. He echoed much of what the manager had said, but Whimsy noticed the way his fingers tapped against his thigh, a rhythm of nervous energy betraying his calm tone. She didn't speak much, Tom said, but she looked at me sort of like she already knew what I'd ask. Beautiful, though, in a cold way. Gave me the shivers, to be honest. Did you see her again? No, sir. Not after that. Whimsy leaned forward, and Mr. Prentice, only once, when he checked in. He asked where the bar was, then changed his mind. Went straight to the lift. No interactions between them that you observed? No, sir. But he hesitated, eyes flicking toward the door. Yes, there was a moment, sir. I can't say it means much, but just before midnight, I took the lift up for a guest on the 3rd floor. On my way back down, I passed the corridor near room 17. I thought I saw someone standing just outside it, not moving, just watching. A woman? I think so, yes, but I can't be sure. She was in shadow. Whimsy dismissed him with a nod and jotted a brief note. Next came Mrs. Tolliver, the daytime maid who had first tried the door that morning. She was clearly unnerved by her involvement, hands wringing a damp handkerchief. Did you notice anything missing or strange in the room? He asked. No, my lord. Everything was in order. The bed hadn't been slept in. The lamp by the armchair was on. The tea tray from the evening before hadn't been touched. Was there anything added to the tray that shouldn't have been there? She blinked. You mean like poison? I mean like something that didn't belong. A cup, a cloth, an extra spoon. She considered. No, sir, nothing like that. Just one cup, untouched. He changed tack. Have you ever seen the woman from room 21 before? Mrs. Tolliver stiffened. Not before last night. No. But I saw her leaving early, very early. Go on. I was coming up from the cellar with linen, and she passed me on the stairs. She didn't use the lift, wore a dark veil over her face, but she moved like someone who didn't want to be seen, fast like. And did she speak? No, just nodded. Whimsy thanked her and waited until she'd gone before saying, quietly, they all remember her. Yet none remember what truly matters, how she got in and out of room 17. And what, precisely, she left behind. Parker, seated nearby, stirred. What do you make of the contradictions? They all believe they are being helpful. Whimsy replied, but deception lies not only in lies, it thrives in the spaces between truths. Hargreaves noticed her composure. Tom felt her coldness. Tolliver caught her vanishing like smoke. And yet none saw her act. They returned to the writing desk. Parker flipped through the case folder. One more, he said. There's a Mr. Ilston, guest in room 19. Claimed to hear nothing, but asked if the incident involved a family matter. Odd thing to say. Whimsy's eyes narrowed. Did he now? Let's have a word. Mr. Ilston was summoned. Tall, bespectacled, and dressed in tweed. He entered with the air of a man used to being slightly ahead of the game. His manner was smooth, genial, but the moment he met Whimsy's eyes, he faltered just briefly, a twitch at the corner of his mouth. I assume this is about the unfortunate event in room 17. He said, You assume correctly. You heard nothing unusual, no cries, no movement. I was reading until nearly 1. But you asked about a family matter. He smiled. It was a guess. The hotel was suddenly awash in whispers, and I happened to recognize the name Penmark. I'm a student of finance, you see. Elgin Penmark's disgrace was a textbook. Collapse. I lectured on it once, actually. Whimsy tilted his head. And his wife, she vanished. Rumors, of course, some say she fled abroad, others that she remarried under another name. But no one really knows. A ghost story of the social pages. And yet, you recognize her name now. Ilston shrugged. One remembers interesting ones. Besides, when I saw her walking the corridor late last night, I thought she looked familiar. Parker stiffened. You saw her? Yes, briefly. Around midnight, she stepped from the lift and went down the hall, toward room 17, I believe. You're certain? I'm quite sure. Whimsy observed him in silence, then said, Why didn't you mention this earlier? I wasn't. Asked. A pause. Tell me, Mr. Ilston, Whimsy said, suddenly genial. Do you often lecture on men who poison their brothers for wealth? The smile faltered again. Only when invited. Whimsy rose, extending a hand. Thank you for your time. We may speak again. When Ilston was gone, Parker said, He knows more, undoubtedly, but not yet enough to condemn him or exonerate her. Still, his comment about the family matter reveals a curious familiarity. Too curious. And the contradictions, they form a shape, Whimsy murmured, staring at the corridor outside room 17. A shape around silence. No one saw her enter, no one saw her leave, but they all saw her exist like a figure in fog, visible only when she chooses to be. He touched the brim of his hat. We must find the fog's source, and I think we've a trail now, one that begins not in hotels or death, but in broken trusts, vanished fortunes, and the ghosts they leave behind. Whimsy stood again in the corridor of the north wing, staring at the stretch between room 17 and room 21. It was not long, perhaps 40 paces, but the way each testimony shaped this space made it feel elastic, distorting time and truth depending on who stepped through it. Every version of events overlapped like translucent film, never aligning cleanly. The woman in black moved like shadow, seen and unseen, leaving memory more than fact behind. But somewhere in these recollections lay motive. Not just one but many, tightly woven, knotted by need and old pain. Back in his suite, he laid the case out in the method he preferred, facts pinned down like butterflies, with threads linking them. A photograph of the dead man Archibald Prentice, though now likely Edgar Penmark, was affixed beside the Queen of Spades card, and a note, no ID. Alias, brother to Elgin P. The blue hotel note with the ominous line sat beside it. The recovered hatpin, the scent of orris root, the cologne bottle with cyanide residue, all added to the tableau. Below it all, he listed the known players, the vanished woman, Ilston of room 19, the observant staff, each with motive but none yet complete. Ilston, most of all, refused to sit neatly in place. Parker entered, coat still damp from the melting snow outside, and dropped a file onto the table. I did some digging, as requested. You were right. About Ilston. Arthur Ilston, Cambridge educated, formerly with Barrow and Fitch Investments. Quietly retired 2 years ago after a scandal involving insider trading. Never formally charged, but disappeared from the circuit. Guess whose firm was connected to the Penmark collapse? Whimsy turned, a small smile tightening at the corners of his mouth. Barrow and Fitch. Parker nodded grimly. I think he was one of the engineers. Penmark took the fall, but someone like Ilston likely profited from the ruin. Whimsy tapped the side of his monocle thoughtfully. He sees the name Penmark reappear, panics, and assumes the worst. He asks about a family matter not because he suspects foul play, but because he's terrified someone's come for him. Then why stay? Because he knows if he runs, it confirms guilt. Men like Ulston rely on appearances as shields, but his fear is too careful phrasing tells us something. He thought he was the target, not the brother, Parker said slowly. Interesting. But that begs the question, Whimsy said, turning back to the board. If Ulston feared being found, and Edgar feared being followed, then someone else was doing the following, and only one person fits that role. Parker exhaled. The woman. Whimsy moved to the window, gazing out at the rooftops, slick with sleet. Let's return to motive. Edgar Penmark fled England after his brother's disgrace. He re-emerges under a false name, alone, possibly to meet someone or resolve unfinished matters. We assume Eleanor Penmark came to confront him. But what if it wasn't revenge? You're suggesting reconciliation, perhaps, or leverage. Consider, Eleanor has been vanished nearly a decade. She returns now, not in anger, but with calculation. She carries poison, yes, but also silence. She writes no demand, no accusation, only a warning. And a sorrowful line, you were always cruelest when kind. That is not the voice of wrath, it is the voice of grief. Parker rubbed his chin. So why kill him? Because Edgar knew something, or had something, and someone else knew that she was seeking him out. Ulston, possibly. But what if there's yet another hand in this? Someone who wanted. Edgar silenced but preferred the murder to seem personal. They were interrupted by a knock. A hotel errand boy entered, cap in hand, offering a small package addressed to Lord Whimsy. No return sender. Whimsy opened it carefully. Inside was a velvet pouch. He reached in and drew out a second playing card, the King of Spades, folded the same way. Along with it, a torn scrap of parchment, yellowed, and written in that same slanted hand, Kings fall for queens. In the end, Whimsy and Parker exchanged a look. She's not gone, Parker murmured. No, Whimsy agreed. And she's speaking in riddles now, which suggests she knows we're watching, or she wants us to. Whimsy pocketed the card, considering. We need to find the financial trail, not just of Edgar, but Eleanor, if she's survived this long. She's had help, money, documents, and she's not the only one who wanted Edgar out of the way. The next morning brought another piece of the web. From the financial records Parker pulled, it emerged that shortly before Edgar checked into the Grand Albion, he'd wired a substantial sum from a French bank to an account in London. The account was under the name Clara D. Marlowe. It had been dormant for years, and Clara, according to buried records, was Eleanor Penmark's mother's maiden name. A second identity. She's been preparing, Whimsy said. A life laid beneath the surface of another. She knew Edgar would eventually return, or be made to. But why now? Because someone else called him back, Whimsy said, voice sharpening. Think. A man like Edgar doesn't just stroll back into the lion's den unless summoned. Blackmailed. Perhaps threatened. Or promised. Something. Parker looked again at the files. We've accounted for Greed Ulston, revenge Eleanor. But there's a gap, jealousy, fear. Who benefits if both Edgar and Eleanor vanish? Whimsy's eyes narrowed. Who indeed? He returned to the testimony from Rosie, the maid. Her recollection of the mysterious woman watching room 17 had struck him as odd, but also her comment about the shoes, fancy. Not the sort you'd wear if you meant to do much walking. What if the woman she saw wasn't Eleanor? He called her back, showed her to sketches a profile from Eleanor's old society photo, and a hotel staff file picture of a now suspended employee, Lillian Devane, formerly of housekeeping, dismissed 2 months ago for stealing jewelry, Rosie's. Eyes widened. That's her, she said, pointing. That's who I saw. But I thought, you thought wrong. Whimsy said softly. The corridor grew colder. Eleanor Penmark might have come to confront Edgar, but someone else had come. To impersonate her. Someone who knew the story. Someone with access, motive and poison. Find Lillian Devane, Whimsy told Parker, his voice quiet and precise. She's the spider in this web, and she's been here all along, pretending not to be. It was late afternoon when the constables, fresh off a report from an informant, near Covent Garden, brought in Lillian Devane, She was smaller than expected, thin beneath her fashionable coat, her manner brittle with affected poise. The fur trim on her collar echoed Rosie's description exactly, but her expression as she entered the lobby of the Grand Albion, half defiant, half curious, was not that of a woman hunted. It was the look of someone who had rehearsed her lines and waited too long to say them. Whimsy watched from the mezzanine as she was led through the lounge and into the manager's office. He noted how she moved, measured steps, deliberate pauses, a brief glance at the corridor where room 17 lay. She wanted to be seen, or rather, she wanted to control what was seen. In questioning, she was careful, smiling often, making light of her past. "Yes, I worked here," she said to Parker, "but I was dismissed over a misunderstanding. I didn't steal anything. I borrowed a brooch. It was returned, and I left quietly. And what brought you back?" Her eyes flicked to the inspector. "Is that what you're asking? Or are you asking why I wore a fur-trimmed coat and walked past room 17 the night that man died?" Parker said nothing. Lillian tilted her head. "You want to know about her, don't you? The lady everyone's pretending not to remember." Whimsy stepped forward, his voice smooth. "We'd prefer the truth to theater, Miss Devane." Her smile sharpened. "Then here it is. I saw her, Eleanor Penmark, in the hotel 2 nights ago. She came to me in the alley behind Red Cross Lane. I hadn't seen her in years. She knew where I had worked, and asked if I could help her get in without being noticed." "And you agreed?" Whimsy asked. Lillian shrugged. "She paid me, told me not to ask questions. I let her in through the service entrance. She went up alone. I never saw her again." Parker stared. "You're admitting to aiding a wanted woman?" "I didn't know she was wanted," Lillian said, not missing a beat. "She was dressed like a duchess and had more confidence than God. She said she had unfinished business. I don't ask questions when someone hands me that much cash." Parker was already on his feet. "That's enough. We'll take her in. Conspiracy at the least. Possibly more." But Whimsy didn't move. He watched Lillian as she was led away. Her performance had been too perfect, each detail just plausible, enough to feel real but only on the surface. She had named the ghost everyone sought, pinned the scene on a woman long thought vanished, but something about her story nagged at him. Back in room 17, the dusk light turned the interior cold, shadows blooming in the corners like damp. Whimsy stood before the writing desk, hands behind his back. "She never said she saw Eleanor leave," he said quietly. Parker turned from the window. "What do you mean?" "She said Eleanor entered through the service door, went up alone, but she claims she saw her 2 nights ago, when Edgar Penmark didn't arrive until the following evening." Parker froze. "That's not just a mistake," Whimsy said. "It's a calculated one. She made her story deliberately fit the murder timeline, but misjudged the arrival. No one had released that information publicly. So how would she know the victim checked in the next night? Unless she'd already been watching the hotel." Parker finished grimly. "Or," Whimsy said, "she'd been in the room." The police were already building a case. Lillian Devane, disgraced former employee, allows Eleanor Penmark access, and the grieving widow carries out a long-awaited revenge. The public would devour it. Tragedy, justice, glamour. But for Whimsy, the truth had a different flavor. Bitter, lingering. He returned to the Queen of Spades, still folded in his coat pocket, and to the King, mailed afterward, left deliberately. But Lillian had no reason to leave those behind. They were part of a message meant only for someone listening, a conversation between equals, not a monologue from a petty thief staging a legend. He requested a search of Lillian's flat. It was sparse. She'd been living above her means, gambling occasionally, but nothing to suggest knowledge of cyanide. No traces of writing like the one on the hotel stationery. No jasmine perfume, no trace of Orris route, and no other cards. That evening, a press bulletin went out. "Murder at Grand Albion solved. Jealous ex-servant implicated in poison death." The Inspector General congratulated Parker. The public was content. But Whimsy couldn't sleep. Around midnight, he returned alone to the hotel lounge, empty now but for the low hiss of the gas fireplace. He sat with a brandy, and his thoughts, the playing cards, still gnawed at him. They weren't just clues. They were character sketches. Spades, the suit of intellect, cruelty, and will. The Queen and the King, paired, folded, sent as signals. Lillian had no idea what they meant. She'd latched onto Eleanor's legend because it was convenient, believable, but not true. At 2 in the morning, he visited the night manager's desk. "Tell me," he said softly, "did anyone ask for room 23 the night before the murder?" Hargreaves frowned. "Room 23? No, my lord. It was unoccupied. Has anyone accessed it since?" "No, sir." "Why?" "Because room 23 faces room 17's door directly. It would be the perfect place to wait, or to listen." They opened it. Dusty, unused, but there, in the small ashtray, by the window, lay a stub of a cigarette foreign, Gauloises, French, crushed hastily, still marked with pale lipstick. Whimsy turned to Parker the next morning. Lillian was used, he said, fed just enough truth to make her a convincing villain. But the real author of this tale is still composing the last page. Parker looked grim. So who was in room 23? Whimsy's eyes glinted. Someone who watched Edgar Penmark enter. Room 17. Someone who waited until Lillian had spun her little fable. And someone who knew we would stop looking once we had our villain. He pulled out the 2 cards again, now unfolded. Kings fall for queens in the end, he murmured. But only if the queen plays her hand well. The real queen was still at large, and she was watching. Morning broke over London like a reluctant promise. The frost lingered despite the weak sunlight, casting the rooftops in a dull glaze of silver. Inside Lord Peter Wimsey's flat on Piccadilly, the fire snapped softly in the grate. But his mind remained cold, wound tightly round a single, persistent thread that refused to break. The cigarette stub from room 23, French, Gauloises, lipstick stained. A detail not in the official narrative and one that now pressed against the heart of the lie. Lillian had spun. He knew the scent well. Eleanor Penmark had worn that brand once years ago. In another life, a small indulgence from her Paris days. Before the scandal, before her name became a whisper. It wasn't proof, but it was scent memory, and Whimsy trusted such things. He rang Parker and requested every scrap of correspondence between the Penmark family and their legal advisors prior to the collapse of Elgin's firm. Most of it was the usual denials, frantic telegrams, frozen accounts. But buried in one box was a letter dated May 1917, oddly misfiled, written from an address in Surrey. Signed by a woman named Iris Langridge. Whimsy sat forward. Langridge had once been Eleanor's governess, later dismissed under unclear circumstances. But what caught Whimsy's eye was a passage in the letter, where she warned Elgin of a dangerous woman working beneath your roof, who listens more than she serves. The name was crossed out, blurred by water damage, but the first initial remained L. Lillian Devane. Parker asked when shown the letter, or someone else she replaced. Whimsy replied, "The handwriting's old, but the warning is clear. Elgin was being watched long before the scandal broke." He closed the folder. "We've been thinking of this as a present-day crime," he said. "But it began long ago, before Elgin's disgrace, before Edgar's flight. The seed was planted in the last year of that house's decay, and someone's been tending it ever since." Parker frowned. "You think Eleanor was being watched?" "To not just watched," Whimsy said softly, "followed, and perhaps shielded." A pattern began to form. He requested access to archived employment logs for the Penmark estate. Most of the names were forgettable, but one returned again and again under different guises: Louisa Devane, housemaid, L. Devane, secretary to the solicitor handling the estate, and once, under a fully different alias, Lucy Darrow, companion to Eleanor's invalid aunt, always female, always adjacent, never forward-facing. "Whoever she is," Whimsy said, "she's a ghost with many names, but she's followed this family like ivy on stone, quiet, clinging, unseen, until now." Parker leaned in. "You think the real killer isn't Eleanor or Lillian, but someone else entirely?" "Someone tied to the estate, I think," Whimsy said. "The killer is tied to both, and she's used them as players in a game none of them fully understand." He traced the thread further and found another name: an old butler dismissed from the Penmark estate after a violent disagreement with Edgar over money. His records noted a daughter, Lucille Devane, born 1896, disappeared from public records in 1919 after a charge of petty fraud. Lucille, Lillian, Louisa, Lucy. One woman. Many masks. Wimsey stood in the gloom of the hotel's record room that evening. A stack of guest books spread across the long oak table. He flipped to the ledger from 3 nights before the murder. There it was, room 23, booked under the name Miss Eldero. No accompanying luggage, no meal orders, no activity logged. A single night, a ghost reservation. She never meant to stay, Wimsey said aloud. She meant to see. He closed the book and moved upstairs once again to room 17. The police tape still hung loosely across the doorway. The room smelled faintly of furniture polish and vanished presents. He moved to the writing desk. The blotter had been replaced, but the drawer beneath remained untouched. A small, false bottom gave with pressure. Inside was a slip of yellowed paper, a different hand this time, rougher, more angular. The note read, "He has it. He always did. If I don't return, you'll know." It was unsigned. Parker, reading over his shoulder, said quietly, "Who was the note for Eleanor?" Wimsey replied, "Someone left it here knowing she'd return to this room. It's the only place that makes sense. They were in contact. But who wrote it?" He tapped the table. "That's what we must determine. There was one last place to search. The safety deposit boxes at the solicitor's office handling the Penmark estate had remained sealed since Elgin's death until now. With Parker's assistance and a warrant, they were opened. Inside Eleanor's box were letters, dozens. None signed, but all from Edgar. Long, circular apologies. Warnings about people in the house. Mentions of someone who knows too much. One in particular chilled Wimsey. She's still here, in the walls, in the staff. She tells me one day she'll protect us both from ourselves. I think she means it. Beneath the letters, wrapped in silk, was a deck of playing cards. Only to missing, the Queen and King of Spades. Wimsey held the deck as though it were sacred. "She's not just watching," he whispered. "She's writing." This Parker looked grim. So who is she then? A servant once, a ghost now. A woman so buried in the Penmark tragedy that no one saw her crawl free. Lucille Devane. She killed Edgar. She's framed Eleanor. And she's still out there. And what does she want? Wimsey's voice dropped. To finish what she started. Whatever vengeance she believes she's owed this, wasn't it? Edgar was the beginning. Eleanor is the end. And somewhere, in London, the Queen of Spades was waiting. Wimsey stood before the cold fireplace in room 17. Eyes narrowed at the empty grate as though it were about to confess. The city outside was swaddled in drizzle, the hotel wrapped in the hush of mid-morning service. But he felt the presence of the unseen woman stronger now than ever before. Lucille Devane, no longer merely a name from a blurred personnel file, or a whisper in old letters. She had shaped this drama like a playwright lingering in the wings, adjusting entrances and exits until her tragedy unfolded just so. And yet her mistake was assuming the performance had ended. He paced to the window, then back again. The playing cards, the misremembered dates, the note hidden in the drawer all formed a pattern. But not a trap to catch the police, a trap to test Eleanor. And Eleanor, if she had returned at all, had not sprung it. It was time to change the rules. That afternoon, Wimsey requested a meeting with Lillian Devane, still in custody, still clinging to the story she'd been fed. She was brought to an interview room at the station, her coat wrinkled, her mascara smudged, but the gleam of defiance still flashing behind her lashes. "You again," she said. "Here to ask the same questions, because I haven't." "No," Wimsey interrupted smoothly, "not the same. I'm here to ask you what you think Lucille wants from you now." She flinched, just slightly. He leaned forward. "You don't need to lie, Lillian. Not to me. You were used, recruited, fed a story that would make you seem important enough to take the fall. But Lucille never intended to protect you. She needed a distraction. Someone to resemble Eleanor at a glance. Someone with a grudge. Someone foolish. Enough to believe she'd been chosen. You weren't. You were convenient." Lillian sat motionless, face pale, eyes locked on his. Then she dropped her gaze. "I thought she was helping me," she said at last. "I was out of work. I'd heard about Eleanor through the gossip from the old staff. Then Lucille found me. Said we were related distantly, that we shared blood. I didn't question it. She told me Eleanor was coming back, that I could be part of making it right, that I'd be seen. Whimsy nodded. Seen but not remembered. She gave you a coat, a script, and then vanished the moment things turned real. Tell me something. Miss Devane, did she ever ask you to smoke French cigarettes? Lillian looked confused. No. Then she was never preparing you to be the real impersonator, he said. She simply needed you close enough to blur the picture. She was always going to remain hidden just as she always has. Whimsy left the station with a renewed sense of direction. He didn't need to find Lucille. He needed her to reveal herself, and he had an idea how. He returned to the Grand Albion and requested the lounge for a private booking. Then, he sent word to the press that Lord Peter Wimsey would be giving a brief statement regarding the conclusion of the Penmark Hotel affair. He made certain the announcement mentioned that Eleanor Penmark would be in attendance. It was a lie, a theatrical one. But Lucille had spent years creating a stage. He was merely adjusting the lighting. By 7 o'clock, the lounge was softly lit, the press arrayed like curious birds behind a velvet rope. No cameras, just notebooks and murmured speculation. A fireplace burned at the far wall. Whimsy took a seat near it with Parker behind him. And just before the hour struck, she entered. Not dramatically, not at all. She came in through the side entrance, wearing a simple black dress and a gray shawl. Her hair was up, her face unpainted. She blended in with the quiet dignity of a woman used to moving unseen. Only Whimsy noticed her at first. She sat near the corner, beside the drinks trolley, where the shadows fell deepest. She did not blink as he rose to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I appreciate your presence this evening, but I must correct the record. There's no Eleanor Penmark in this room." A slight shift in the dark, a movement, not flight but a leaning forward, a tension. "What we have instead," Whimsy continued, "is a woman who has lived in the Penmark shadow so long she believes it her birthright. A woman who crafted a fiction so well that even she began to believe it. But murder," he said softly, "is not theater, and revenge is not love." He turned to the darkness. "Isn't that right, Lucille?" The room stilled. She didn't speak. At first, then, slowly, she stood, not in panic, not in denial, but with the tired grace of someone who had waited too long. "You knew I'd come," she said. Double quotes, "Yes." Whimsy replied, "You couldn't resist. You needed to see if the lie had held." She moved forward into the firelight. The lines on her face were fine but deep. She looked like someone who had been young a very long time ago. "I kept them safe," she said, voice calm. "I warned Elgin. I warned Edgar. They didn't listen. Eleanor, she listened once, but then she vanished. I was the only one who remained, and so you became the keeper of the story." Whimsy said, "The queen who guards the ruined court." She looked at him, eyes wet. "I didn't mean to kill him, not like that. But he was going to expose her. He had a letter. He said he'd ruin her name again. I had to stop him. By poisoning his cologne," Whimsy murmured. "You knew he'd wear it to feel important. You'd seen the brand in Paris, and you left the note, knowing Eleanor would find it or believing she would." Lucille nodded. "She was always too kind for this world, too soft. So I did what she couldn't." Parker stepped forward, gently placing a hand on her arm. She didn't resist. As she was led away, she paused at the threshold. "I still have the last letter," she said, "from Eleanor. She forgave him. That's what he feared most, that she'd move on." Whimsy stood alone by the hearth long after they'd gone. The game had been played. The queen had revealed her hand, but there was no triumph in it, only the quiet disassembly of illusion. He reached into his pocket, drew out the queen of spades, and tossed it into the fire. It curled slowly in the flame, blackening to ash. The play was over, but the echoes would linger. Rain had begun to fall. Again by morning, a soft, relentless drizzle that seemed intent on rubbing out the edges of London itself. Lord Peter Wimsey returned to his Piccadilly flat with a kind of weary satisfaction. The sense of a performance concluded, its final bow taken. Lucille Devane had confessed. Quietly and without spectacle, the Queen of Spades had burned in the hearth. The story, by all accounts, was done. But stories, as he well knew, rarely ended cleanly. Parker arrived just after breakfast, his trench coat dripping on the foyer tile, his face unusually pale beneath the collar. "We've got a problem," he said without preamble. Whimsy looked up from his tea. "One assumes this isn't a matter of eggs. The solicitor's office, the Penmark deposit boxes." Whimsy put his cup down. "Go on." Parker dropped a thin file onto the table. "Someone broke into the archive vault overnight. They bypassed the door alarm using an internal code. Not forced entry access. Deliberate. The contents of Eleanor's box were taken." Whimsy stood slowly. "All of them, everything. The letters, the deck of cards, the financial papers, even the silk wrapping." Parker hesitated. It was precise. Someone knew what they were looking for. Whimsy's mind moved quickly. Lucille confessed publicly. Her arrest was witnessed by half the press. This isn't about silencing her. It's about control, suppression. The confession doesn't matter if the physical proof disappears. The motive becomes speculative. The connection to the Penmark letters gone. And the true story becomes a rumor again. "Exactly," Parker said. "They're trying to wash the crime back into myth." Whimsy's fingers tapped the edge of the table. "And Lucille?" he asked quietly. "Still in custody?" "She hasn't been told yet." "Don't," Whimsy said. "Not until we know how deep this goes." He returned to the fire, now cold and gray with ash. He stared into it, mind turning over the implications. Lucille had acted alone, in the physical sense, but she hadn't worked in a vacuum. Someone had aided her, or at the very least, known what she was doing and waited to act until she'd been removed from the board. Someone clever, someone patient, someone with access. The phone rang. It was the solicitor's junior assistant, a pale-voiced man named Fellows, calling with a nervous tremble. I didn't know who else to ring, my lord. It's about the key." "What key?" Whimsy asked. "The internal vault key, only to exist. One is locked in the senior partner's safe. The other, well, it went missing a month ago. We assumed it had been misfiled. And you didn't report this. It wasn't unusual," Fellows stammered. "We thought perhaps someone had moved it between departments. It's happened before." "Indeed," Whimsy said, "and now it's turned up in a lock that wasn't meant to be opened." After the call, Whimsy and Parker made a quiet visit to the Albion once more. Something still lingered there, an itch of unfinished business. He requested to check the items logged from room 17 again, just in case. The hotel clerk knew younger. Apologetic led them to the secure cupboard, unlocked it, and frowned. I'm sorry, my lord. That's odd. The bottle's not here." "What bottle?" "The cologne. The one you asked us to preserve." Parker stiffened. "You logged that bottle into evidence last week. It had the poison trace." "I know, sir. But it's gone. There's no sign of forced entry, and the other items are untouched. But that," he gestured helplessly, "that's gone." Whimsy's face was expressionless. "To disappearances," he said softly. "Both within 48 hours of Lucille's arrest. Someone is cleaning the stage, erasing the props." Parker swore under his breath. "So what now? No letters, no bottle. All we've got is a confession. And that'll get shredded in court without physical proof." Whimsy's mind turned toward the Queen again. But not the card. The woman, Lucille, had built her life around control. But that kind of obsession couldn't help but create ripples. "She'd been thorough but not invisible," she wrote. He said suddenly. Parker blinked. "What?" "She wrote to Eleanor dozens of times. By her own admission. We found letters from Edgar, but Lucille said there were replies. Those had to go somewhere. You think Eleanor kept them?" "No, I think she burned them. But she wouldn't burn all of them, not if they frightened her. Not if she believed Lucille had crossed a line." He snapped his fingers. "The aunt, which one Eleanor's maternal Aunt Beatrice Langridge, invalid, lived in Sussex until her death last year. Lucille worked for her briefly. If Eleanor feared Lucille, she would have written someone. And Beatrice is the only relative she trusted. They traveled to Sussex that evening. The house was quiet, shuttered since Beatrice's death. But her companion, a stout, no-nonsense woman named Mrs. Hales, still lived in the nearby village and kept the keys. "Oh yes," she said when Whimsy asked. Miss Eleanor used to send letters now and then. Always asked for them to be read aloud to Miss Beatrice. I kept some, I think." She rummaged through a small locked chest and drew out a bundle tied with blue ribbon. They didn't seem important, but they sounded sad, full of warning. Whimsy took the bundle gently. Parker began to read one aloud. "He says he's coming back, but Lucille follows me still. I saw her in Brussels. I told her to stop, but she smiled. And she said, 'One day you'll thank me for what I'll do.'" The room was silent for a moment. Whimsy whispered. She confessed long before the murder, but no one was listening. With the letters in hand, the tide began to turn. Parker arranged for them to be entered into the court record, not as direct evidence of the crime, but as proof of obsession of pattern, motive, and predation. Still, the missing cologne bottle and vanished legal documents cast shadows. Someone, even now, was working to cloud the water. They were methodical, almost surgical. That night, back in his flat, Whimsy received a thin envelope without return address. Inside was a single card, the Joker. On its back, "One game ends, another begins." Whimsy smiled darkly. The queen had fallen, but now a trickster had entered the deck. The Joker card lay on Whimsy's desk long after the fire had burned low. It was crisp, clean, and recent like the faded deck found in Eleanor's deposit box. This card was no relic. It was fresh ink and fresh intent. A message from someone not yet done. Lucille Devane, for all her meticulous planning, had never played with jest. Her obsession with symmetry and retribution left no room for whimsy. This card was different. A new hand had entered the game. Whimsy tapped the card slowly, eyes distant. Parker sat opposite, arms folded. "She's behind bars," Parker said. "But someone else is still playing." Whimsy nodded. "And they've waited until now to make their move. When Lucille's been taken out of circulation, when the evidence is thin and the narrative uncertain, that's when the magician steps forward." He didn't sleep that night. By morning, news arrived from the courthouse. Lucille had been moved to a medical wing after a fainting spell. The guards said she'd been calm, almost too calm, and then collapsed without warning. No sign of poisoning. Numbered drugs in her cell, but the timing raised red flags. She hadn't spoken since. A doctor claimed shock. Whimsy suspected silence was strategic. Before he could act on it, a second report arrived, this one from the Albion Hotel. A body had been found, not in room 17, but 2 doors down in room 21. A maid discovered it shortly after 10 a.m. having, not for cleaning and receiving no answer, entered with the master key. The occupant had checked in under the name James Delaney, a middle-aged man with no luggage and a forged passport. Cause of death, stabbing. Precise, clean. No signs of struggle, no weapon left behind. Whimsy and Parker arrived to find the hotel in a quiet panic. "It's the same corridor," Parker said as they ducked beneath the police cordon. "Same floor. You think it's connected. I think it's deliberate," Whimsy said. "Lucille's shadow lingers over room 17. So this." He gestured toward the door of 21. "Draws our eyes away." A feint. The room was pristine, the bed untouched, curtains drawn. Delaney's body lay on the carpet, collapsed against the writing desk, his coat still on. No wallet, no personal effects, but something sat neatly on the edge of the desk. A single playing card. The Joker. No writing, just the figure, dancing with its cap and bells. "This was staged," Whimsy said. "Whoever killed him wanted him found. Wanted us to see this." Parker glanced at the card, then at the corpse. But who was he? They ran the prints through records and soon had a name. Joseph Maynard. Former military intelligence. Discharged 10 years prior. No known address. But flagged once for surveillance work on a private contract, possibly overseas. No reason to be in the Albion. No known connection to the Penmarks. Except one. An old security detail buried in ministry records had him listed as attached briefly to Elgin Penmark's business holdings in Vienna. A year before the collapse, he was watching someone, Parker said, or something, or he came to warn someone, Whimsy murmured, and paid for it. Back at the station, he reviewed the visitor logs from Lucille's detainment. No one had seen her in person since her confession, no phone calls, no legal advisor. But a note had been found in her possession, a torn envelope with only a partial postmark and no letter inside. Whimsy stared at it. The writing on the envelope was old-fashioned, slanted and deliberate, familiar. He took out a letter from Eleanor's recovered correspondence, the one written in the same hand Lucille used for her final warning, and compared the address. A match. She didn't write to herself, Whimsy said. Someone wrote to her. Someone who's still communicating. Parker frowned. A handler, a partner, Whimsy said. Or a successor. Someone who watched Lucille build her castle of vengeance and waited until the drawbridge lowered. Later that evening, Whimsy walked the halls of the Albion alone. Floor 3 still closed off. Still quiet. Room 17 remained sealed. Room 21 had been cleared, but the scent of blood still hung faintly in the air. He paused between the two, staring at the fire alarm affixed to the wall. It had been rewired recently. Maintenance logs showed a repair order from 3 days ago, but no call had been placed. He opened the cover. Inside, a tiny device no larger than a thimble was affixed to the rear wall, a microphone. A bug, Parker said when Whimsy brought it in. Whoever was in room 21 wasn't just waiting. He was listening to Lucille, Whimsy said, to room 17, to everything, and when he heard enough, Whimsy nodded. He had to be silenced, but why now? He sat back at his desk that night and reviewed every note, every scrap of dialogue Lucille had given them. Then, suddenly, he saw it. A throwaway line from her confession, spoken just before the officers cuffed her. There's another letter. The first one, the one that started it all. He doesn't know I still have it. At the time, it had seemed cryptic, perhaps delusional. Now it felt like prophecy. The sentence echoed in Whimsy's mind with increasing clarity. There's another letter. The first one, the one that started it all. He doesn't know I still have it. The more he turned it over, the more he became convinced it wasn't a madwoman's delusion, it was a thread. And as with any good thread, if one pulled it gently and steadily enough, the entire tapestry would begin to loosen. Back at Scotland Yard, he demanded a thorough search of Lucille Devane's belongings, again not her official effects logged by the constables, but the ones seized from her flat, the corners overlooked, the cracks between floorboards. Parker, skeptical but compliant, dispatched to plainclothes officers. By dusk, they returned with nothing new except an old sewing case, lined with velvet and crammed with yellowing patterns, measuring tape, and 3 cracked buttons. Whimsy opened it without interest until he saw the lining, tattered, sloppily restitched. A tug at the frayed seam revealed a hidden pocket, and, folded inside it, a single sheet of stationery, creased but preserved. The heading was unfamiliar. From the desk of E.N. the date, June 3rd, 1921. Whimsy smoothed the page flat. Lucille, you are the only one I trust now. Elgin's lost. Eleanor's worse. I've found something in the account, something they will kill me over if I speak. I cannot put it in writing, but you must keep this letter safe, if anything happens to me. This is the only proof I ever feared them. Edgar, no signature, but the scrawl was unmistakable. Whimsy stared at it, mind racing. This was the letter, not a confession and implication, a warning. Edgar hadn't merely feared exposure, he'd stumbled onto something deeper years ago. The kind of thing that makes people vanish quietly, and he had entrusted it not to his wife, nor his brother, but to Lucille. Now someone else wanted it. Gone, and someone had assumed it already was. That changed everything. He hurried to Parker, who had already begun drafting a preliminary case brief around Joseph Maynard's death. The former intelligence agent had no reason to be at the Albion, no reason to be near Lucille. But now, the motive was visible. He was after the letter, Whimsy said, laying the creased sheet on the table. This is what he was listening for. When he heard her mention it, he panicked. She wasn't supposed to still have it. Parker frowned. You're saying the new killer, whoever sent that Joker card, is not just trying to erase Lucille's story, but something much older? Exactly. Lucille framed Eleanor to protect her. But Edgar's secret, whatever it was, would undo more than just the murder narrative. It would rewrite the fall of the entire Penmark name. Lucille's revenge was personal. This, he tapped, The letter is structural. They had to go further back. Whimsy requested access to the Penmark financial archives. Not just the late years of Elgin's collapse, but the stable period before the scandal. Records were stored at the London offices of a firm called Braithwaite & Lowe, untouched since a trustee dispute in 1923. It took 2 hours of wrangling and one rather sharp telegram from the Home Office to open the ledgers, but when they did, the pattern surfaced. Wimsey sat at a long oak table, ledger after ledger opened beside him. His fingers paused on an entry, a payment listed as Client Retainer Vienna Office JD recurring. Unremarkable, but attached to no real invoices. The amount £300 quarterly was significant for the time, and the initials matched. Joseph Maynard, Parker said, reading over his shoulder. Exactly. He was on the books, unofficially. Elgin must have hired him privately, off-ledger, through a dummy client, probably to spy on someone within his own firm. Any idea who? Whimsy nodded grimly. His own wife. That explained Edgar's letter and Lucille's loyalty. Eleanor had known more than she let on, perhaps even confronted Elgin with it. The financial manipulation hadn't been to save the estate, it had been to isolate Eleanor, cut her out of succession, keep her quiet. And Edgar, caught between loyalty and horror, had turned to the only person who would act without question, Lucille. She didn't just love Eleanor, Whimsy said. She worshipped her, saw herself as the quiet blade protecting the queen. But Edgar's note wasn't about revenge. It was about exposure. Parker leaned against the table. So someone else knew. Someone else who's been watching. Who got close enough to kill Maynard when he got too near and is now trying to erase everything. Someone, Whimsy said slowly, with a taste for performance. They returned to the Albion that evening to speak with the night manager, the one who had authorized the fire alarm repair days before Maynard's death, Mr. Remley. Whimsy said, "You said you received a service request." Remley blinked. "Yes, written request. On hotel stationery. Came through the internal mailbox. Do you still have it?" He retrieved it. The handwriting was careful, too careful, deliberately bland, with just enough slant to mimic a left-handed script. Whimsy held it up beside the envelope Lucille had kept. It wasn't the same hand, but the style matched something else. The Joker card. "Get me the guest logs for last week," he said. "Cross-reference every check-in against Penmark estate employees, especially old ones, former staff, anyone who could disappear into a hotel and leave no ripple." It took an hour, but the name surfaced. D. Harrow. Checked into room 315 for 2 nights, paid cash. No luggage, no forwarding address. Whimsy froze. "Harrow," he whispered. Lucille once used the name Lucy Darrow. Harrow is a variation. Someone linked to her. A student, a protege, a disciple. Parker shook his head. Or a cleaner. Sent him to finish what Lucille started and erase what she regretted. Whimsy folded the letter again. The pieces were in place. The Joker hadn't appeared as chaos. He had appeared as balance, to correct what Lucille had allowed to survive. But he hadn't counted on the letter. The truth had always been visible, hidden not in the grand gestures, but in the overlooked details. A forged repair slip, an altered guest name, a payment without purpose, a pattern emerging like ink through water. They weren't chasing one killer now. They were chasing a network, a preservation society of silence. And the game had just escalated. Wimsey stood at the window of his flat. The lights of Piccadilly reflected faintly in the glass. Behind him, the letter lay open on the desk once more, Edgar's slanted script faint beneath the yellowed paper. Rain whispered against the panes like a conspirator trying to be heard. But even the weather couldn't speak louder than the revelation forming in his mind. The motive wasn't power. Not entirely, nor money, though the Penmark accounts reeked of it. It wasn't just revenge either. That was Lucille's territory. The Joker had a different agenda. Colder, more exacting. The pieces no longer pointed to a singular emotion. They circled around something else. Preservation. Parker returned just before midnight, coat soaked and breath sharp from the chill. "He's gone," he said. "The Harrow alias. The guest left the Albion 3 days ago. But we traced a train ticket bought in the same name to a boarding house in Dover. Empty. No prints. Just one thing left behind. He handed Whimsy a photograph. It was old, faded. A group of Penmark employees gathered at a summer function. On the back, Land's End, July 1917. In the center stood Lucille, unmistakable even then, younger and more severe. Next to her a man, ordinary in appearance, but with a stiffness about the shoulders. His name was not written, but Whimsy remembered his face. Douglas Harrow. He murmured, not a pseudonym, a real person and a real past. He dropped into the armchair and stared into the fire as Parker paced. What's his angle? Parker said. Lucille was obsessed with Eleanor. Edgar feared Elgin. But Harrow, he just erases. Quietly, precisely, as if he's guarding something. But what? Whimsy was silent for a long moment. Then he said, do you remember what Lucille said? He doesn't know I still have it. Not they. He. That wasn't a warning to us. It was defiance against someone she'd once obeyed. Parker frowned. You think Harrow and Lucille were connected? More than connected. He taught her, shaped her. The deeper motive began to unspool. Whimsy reached for the stack of Eleanor's old letters and thumbed through them, looking not at the words, but at the tone. They grew colder, more withdrawn over time. In one, dated 1922, she mentioned being followed. In another, she described her fear of those who call loyalty a virtue only when it silences dissent. He stood abruptly. We've been looking at this as a crime of passion. But it wasn't. Not for Harrow. It was ideological. Parker blinked. What ideology? Order, Whimsy said quietly. Not the kind that keeps a household running. The kind that believes truth itself is dangerous when it threatens structure. He walked to the shelf and pulled down an old journal from the Penmark Estate trustees. A record of board members, internal meetings, policy notes. Harrow's name never appeared. But a symbol did. A small, hand-drawn motif resembling a chess. Night subtle, repeated over years, always beside certain board votes, disciplinary actions, staff evaluations. The symbol appeared next to Lucille's name when she was promoted in 1920. And again when Eleanor was sent to Vienna sidelined. Distanced, Douglas Harrow, Whimsy said slowly, was not just an employee. He was part of something within the Penmark legacy, a kind of secret guardianship, their version of internal security, not for assets, for reputation. Parker sat heavily, a cleaner. Exactly, whenever scandal brewed, embezzlement, affairs, betrayal, Harrow was dispatched. Quietly, effectively. He trained Lucille to do the same. She inherited his doctrine, but where he prized silence, she craved meaning. And when she snapped, Parker added, she didn't just betray Eleanor's enemies, she betrayed Harrow by making it loud. Whimsy nodded. He couldn't allow that. Lucille's entire theater, the notes, the poisoning, the room was anathema to him. That's why he didn't stop her beforehand. He believed she wouldn't go that far. But when she did, he moved to erase it all. Parker looked at the fire. But why protect Elgin? He was a wreck. He drove his family to ruin. It wasn't about Elgin, Whimsy said. It was about the myth of Elgin, the name, the appearance of legacy and control. Harrow is the kind of man who believes the truth must serve the greater narrative, that the past, if it is to be preserved, must be curated, and anyone who tries to rewrite it, Eleanor, Edgar, Lucille, must be silenced. He picked up the joker card again, still lying on the desk. It was never about mischief. It was about paradox. Harrow believes that chaos is what happens when people start telling their own stories. Parker stood. Then what now? We've got the letter. We've got Maynard's body. We've got the thread. But not the end, Whimsy said. Not yet. He turned to the window again. Harrow's still out there, and he hasn't lost. He's regrouping. He reached into his pocket and drew out the Queen of Spades, the one they'd thought lost, but which he'd found tucked inside Lucille's sewing case beside the letter. He stared at the pale, angular face of the Queen. She was a pawn in his game, Whimsy said. But she thought she was a queen. That's the tragedy. But Harrow, he's the one moving the pieces. And now, for the first time, Whimsy saw the full board, not just the crime, but the structure that birthed it. The motive wasn't money. It wasn't rage. It was control. A life's work spent ensuring the story stayed just so. And when it threatened to veer, when Eleanor dared speak, when Edgar hinted, when Lucille broke formation, Harrow tightened his grip. Whimsy flicked the Joker card into the fire. It twisted once and caught flame, curling at the edges. "I'm done reacting," he said quietly. "It's time to make a move." And for the first time since Room 17, he felt the killer's mind not in fragments, but whole. It wasn't a murderer they were hunting. It was a historian who killed to keep his version of the past intact, and he was far from finished. The morning fog clung to London like a shroud as Whimsy and Parker made their way through the city streets toward the Penmark Estate's former administrative building, now nearly deserted except for a handful of trustees and archivists. It was the place where the scandal had first begun to unravel years before, and, as Whimsy had come to understand, the very ground where Douglas Harrow had once laid his shadowy hand on the family's secrets. Whimsy's mind was steady, his every step measured. He had spent the past 2 days weaving a careful web, contacts made, invitations sent, surveillance arranged. This was no longer a game of catch-up. It was a chess match with the master tactician, and Whimsy intended to corner his quarry inside the hushed building. Whimsy arranged to meet the trustees under the guise of discussing the final disposition of the Penmark archives. The plan was simple: lure Harrow out with the promise of an old ledger recently discovered, a ledger Whimsy himself had carefully forged and slipped into the system, a bait rich enough to tempt even the most cautious predator. The trustees arrived, a small group of aging men and women, some familiar, some strangers, each carrying their own loyalties and suspicions. Whimsy could feel their eyes flicker with curiosity as he unveiled the ledger, a worn, leather-bound book with Harrow's symbol discreetly embossed in the corner. The room's atmosphere thickened. "Mr. Harrow," Whimsy began softly, "it appears you may have been more involved in these records than previously acknowledged. Our inquiry cannot proceed without your insight. It is imperative you join us." Silence fell like a curtain. Then, unexpectedly, the door at the far end opened, and a man stepped into the room, tall, lean, with sharp features that bespoke a life lived in the shadows. His eyes were dark, intelligent, and cold. "Douglas Harrow, Mr. Whimsy," he said with a dry tone that barely concealed contempt. "I wondered how long before you drew me out." Whimsy smiled thinly, folding his hands on the table. "Longer than I would have preferred. But it seems you underestimated the tenacity of those who seek the truth." Harrow's gaze flicked to the ledger. "You play a dangerous game, detective." "Dangerous," Whimsy echoed. "Perhaps, but it's a game you have already lost." Harrow took a slow step forward, his voice low. "You think this is about lost documents, about money, about petty crimes? You misunderstand. This is about legacy, about preserving order in a world teetering on chaos. My methods are ruthless because the alternative is anarchy." Parker shifted beside Whimsy, but said nothing. "And what of Lucille Devane?" Whimsy asked. "Your student, your apprentice. Why did she have to die?" A flicker of something, a shadow of pain, regret, crossed Harrow's face. "She was reckless, too impulsive. She thought justice could be served with spectacle. She believed in exposing the rot. But in doing so, she invited destruction upon us all. I tried to guide her back, but she would not listen." Whimsy's eyes narrowed. "Then why kill Maynard? To protect the narrative." He was growing curious, dangerous. His loyalty wavered. "I had no choice." The tension in the room became almost unbearable. Whimsy leaned forward. "And Eleanor Penmark?" "The victim of circumstance," Harrow said sharply. "A woman caught between the lies of her family and the truths she dared whisper. She was a threat because she knew, because she tried to resist." The detective's voice dropped. "You silenced all who threatened your order." Harrow nodded solemnly. "Sometimes the greatest crimes are committed in the name of preservation." Suddenly, Harrow's expression hardened. "But you forget, Whimsy. I have the advantage here. You have no proof, no witnesses, and no idea what lengths I am prepared to go." Whimsy's fingers twitched imperceptibly beneath the table. "On the contrary," he said smoothly, "I have every length measured, the letters, the ledger, the confessions, your own past documented by those you thought unseen." He signaled, subtly, and the doors burst open as officers poured in, sealing exits and sweeping the room. Harrow's eyes flickered to the doorway, calculating escape routes. No. Whimsy's voice was calm but firm. It's over. For a moment, Harrow's mask cracked. He glanced toward a window, then back at Whimsy. You don't understand. The game doesn't end with me. You may capture me, but the players remain. You must judge the spirit of this game. Whimsy replied, We have cleared the board. With a slow, deliberate motion, Harrow reached into his pocket. Parker tensed. But instead of a weapon, he withdrew a folded piece of paper and placed it on the table. Then take this, Harrow said, voice low. The last piece. Whimsy unfolded it carefully. It was a list of names: trusted associates, financiers, men who had kept the Penmark legacy intact through decades of quiet manipulation. And what of these men? Whimsy asked. Your next game, Harrow whispered, as officers moved to restrain him outside. As Harrow was led away, Whimsy felt the weight of the case settle. The truth was a tangled web. But at last, the master manipulator was caught. The hidden motives exposed, the pattern laid bare. The legacy of Room 17 would no longer be a shadow. The game was over. For now, it should have felt like closure. Whimsy stood in the echoing chamber of the Penmark archives long after Douglas Harrow had been led away. The room still carried the scent of old paper and damp wood, but now it was silent. The list Harrow had handed over lay on the table. A simple sheet of thin stationery with names: men of influence, money, discretion. Yet as he stared at the paper, an unease crawled along the base of his neck. Something didn't fit. Not the confessions, not the cover-ups, not even Harrow's austere logic. It was the list. Harrow had presented it like a final move, a self-sacrificial flourish. But Harrow had never been theatrical. He hated spectacle. That had been Lucille's crime, not his. Which meant the gesture hadn't been sincere, it had been calculated. Whimsy turned the paper over. Blank, no watermark. Cheap stock, too ordinary for a man like Harrow. The ink had minor inconsistencies in flow. Manual pen, yes, but it wasn't Harrow's usual neatness. It was a deliberate facsimile, a forgery, a misdirection. He snapped upright. Parker, he barked, and within moments, his partner reappeared from down the hall, coat in hand. We've made a mistake, Whimsy said. Parker blinked. We've got him. We've got everything. No, Whimsy said, voice tightening. Harrow's not the mastermind. He's the guardian, the protector. He plays cleanup. But someone else wrote the script. Someone who understood the need for control and the allure of chaos. Someone who sent Lucille over the edge and then stood back, letting Harrow carry the blame. Parker furrowed his brow. Who? Whimsy didn't answer right away. He was scanning the shelves, pacing rapidly. Between the rows, something had been nudging at the back of his mind for days now. Not a fact, but a tone, a rhythm. The way events had unfolded, the way the clues had been left behind, designed for him to follow. Lucille's elaborate scenes, Maynard's carefully staged death, even the Joker cards. It wasn't Harrow's style. He preferred shadows. But this had flair. There's someone else, Whimsy said softly. Someone who orchestrated both Harrow and Lucille. Someone who knew their weaknesses. He stopped suddenly, breath catching. Oh my God, he whispered. Parker stared at him. Whimsy? He turned slowly, eyes narrowing. We were watching the stage, Parker. But the puppeteer was behind us the entire time. It was nearly midnight. When they arrived at the institution, the private care home nestled just outside the city limits, tucked behind high hedges and wrought iron gates. Eleanor Penmark had been transferred there a year prior, her condition deemed too fragile for open interviews, her name too delicate for publicity. She was, by all accounts, nearly catatonic. Or so they'd been told. The nurse on duty tried to protest their visit, but Whimsy flashed his badge and pushed past. They found Eleanor in a sunlit room, seated in a high-backed chair, gazing at nothing in particular. Whimsy approached slowly, heart pounding. Miss Penmark, he said gently. She didn't respond. He placed something on the side table. It was the Queen of Spades. Her eyes moved, just barely, a flicker of attention. I thought you were the victim, Whimsy said quietly. The innocent, the pawn, the catalyst. But you were never the target. She blinked once. You were the director. Silence. Then, very softly, Eleanor smiled. You were always so clever, Lord Whimsy, she said. Her voice a whisper of silk. I wondered how long it would take. Parker stared. You were supposed to be broken. Eleanor turned her head. Her eyes, pale and glassy, gleamed with something far older than madness. I was, once. But I grew tired of watching men like Harrow mold my life into what suited their legacy. Tired of watching Lucille rot in the shadow of a family name, Whimsy. Stepped back, stunned. You manipulated them both. Of course, she said. Lucille loved me. I used that. Harrow feared disorder. I gave him something to fear. Maynard was loyal to Edgar. I turned him loose, then sent him to die where I could make a point. And Lucille, oh, my poor, devoted Lucille, she thought she was avenging me. But really, she was just setting the stage. Whimsy's voice dropped. You sent the Joker cards. Eleanor's smile widened. A bit obvious, but it got your attention. But why now? Because I'm dying, she said simply. And I will not let the last chapter of my life be written by men like Harrow or Elgin or anyone who thought I was weak. I was watching for decades, and I waited. And when the right people were in the right place, I acted. Parker shook his head. And the deaths, the poisonings, you didn't stop any of it. I didn't start it either, she said. I just nudged the dominoes. Lucille did what she believed was justice. Harrow did what he believed was duty. I simply watched and made sure neither won. Whimsy stared at her, the enormity of it settling like dust after a bomb. You've committed no crime, he said slowly. You orchestrated events, but didn't act. I told no lies, she replied. I just allowed people to be who they already were. The room fell silent. Outside, wind stirred the hedges, but inside, all was still. Then Eleanor leaned forward. Slightly. Tell me, Lord Whimsy, she said. Now that you know the truth, what will you do with it? He didn't answer. Because in truth, he didn't know. Whimsy stared at Eleanor Penmark, his mind parsing the quiet venom of her confession. She had spoken without pride or remorse, as if describing a complex play whose plot she merely adjusted when needed. It was not madness that stirred behind her eyes, nor vengeance in its rawest form. It was control, the kind of patient, calculated control that Douglas Harrow had once wielded, but she had turned his tools against him. He sat down, slowly, across from her. The Queen of Spades still rested on the side table between them. You planned every step, he said. Or, rather, you predicted them. I understood the roles, she said softly. Lucille needed to believe she could protect me. Harrow needed to believe he was the last custodian of order. She tilted her head. You needed a puzzle. And the deaths, Whimsy asked, were they just consequences to you? No, she replied. They were part of the structure. Once the play began, it had to unfold. I couldn't control everything, not Lucille's desperation, not Harrow's panic, but I could shape the boundaries. The rest I left to nature. Parker paced in the background, silent for once, his usually reliable instincts thrown into disarray. Whimsy didn't need to look at him. He felt the same unease. Justice had always been the end of a path, a gate to closure. But what did it mean when the end was also the beginning? And justice itself had been just another piece on the board. You're not well, Whimsy said. Finally. But you're not insane. You knew what you were doing. I still do. I could have you charged, he said, with conspiracy, with obstruction, with accessory to murder. Eleanor gave him a sad smile. And would they try a dying woman who never lifted a weapon? What would the Crown say? That I pulled the strings of loyal servants and mad women from the edge of a hospital bed? Whimsy leaned back. The room felt colder. No, he said. They'd let you slip into the footnotes, just as you expected. I don't want to be in footnotes. Lord Whimsy, I want to be forgotten. The Penmark name was never mine to redeem, but I could ensure no one else bore its sins. He reached slowly into his coat and pulled out the forged ledger Harrow had tried to protect. You used this to flush him out. Yes, and the letter Edgar wrote. I told Lucille to keep it. Told her it would keep her safe, but it was never protection, it was bait. Whimsy studied her. She looked frail, almost translucent. But she had more control over this ending than anyone he'd ever pursued. Outside, the wind pressed hard against the windows. "Do you regret it?" he asked. Eleanor's voice was almost a whisper. "No, because if I hadn't done it, they would have kept going. Harrow, the trustees, the ghost of Elgin. They would have bled this story into another generation. I just stopped the clock." Whimsy stood, placing his gloves back on. The card remained on the table. "Time won't remember you kindly," he said. "I don't want kindness," she replied. "I want silence." He gave her one last look, then turned and walked away. Parker followed. Back in the car, neither spoke for a while. The engine idled. "So that's it?" Parker finally asked. "She wins?" Whimsy stared out at the trees swaying in the night wind. "She ends it," he said. "But she doesn't win. No one wins. Not Lucille, not Harrow, not Eleanor. They all tried to master something none of us ever really can, which is the story. Once you release it, it tells itself." Back at his flat, the case files lay in quiet stacks. Whimsy poured a drink, then opened his notebook, where the first details of Room 17 had been scrawled weeks ago. The crime scene, the poison tea, the missing key. All of it made sense now, not as disconnected events, but as a performance, each act perfectly cast. He drew a slow line from Lucille's name to Eleanor's, from Harrow's to Edgar's, and finally from the Joker card to the Queen of Spades. Then, with a quiet exhale, he turned to Parker. "I missed one clue," he said. Parker leaned in. "Which? When we first searched Lucille's flat, there was a chessboard set up mid-game. Bishop in the corner, knight drawn forward, queen in the center. So, I assumed it was hers. But it was Eleanor's. She'd been there before. That board was a signature, a declaration. She'd already made her first move." Parker shook his head slowly. "You knew, deep down." "I did," Whimsy admitted. "But she wanted me to follow her breadcrumbs. She needed someone to tell the story at the end." He closed the notebook. "And that's the only justice she ever really wanted." He didn't sleep that night, but he didn't need to, because sometimes justice doesn't wear a robe or swing a gavel. Sometimes it sits in a quiet room, breathing, shallowly watching the world forget. And that, Whimsy realized, was the final move. The rain had ceased some time before dawn, but the streets still wore its sheen like a fresh wound. London exhaled steam and silence, a city stirring back to its regular rhythm. In his flat above Piccadilly, Lord Peter Whimsy sat with a lukewarm cup of tea cooling beside him. The last of the case notes spread across his table in careful, deliberate order. He had meant to burn them. He still might, but something kept his fingers hovering over the first page, the witness statement from the maid at the Penmark townhouse. She had described the locked door, the eerie stillness in Room 17, the strange scent lingering in the hallway, and a final, almost forgotten detail, a faint music box tune, playing from somewhere upstairs. He hadn't thought of it since. Music boxes were common in such homes, sentimental ornaments, relics of childhood. But Eleanor's room hadn't contained one, nor had Lucille's, according to the estate inventory. So whose was it? He leaned forward, flipping back through the records. Harrow wouldn't have left behind something so evocative, and Lucille had hated music, found it too distracting. She'd once written in her diary, the sound hadn't been an oversight. It had been a signal. He rose and crossed to the small cabinet by the fireplace where he'd kept the Queen of Spades. It still lay there, untouched since his last visit to Eleanor. But now, looking at it again, he noticed something beneath the surface image, something pressed faintly into the card's back. He held it to the light. It wasn't a design. It was a number. For 8-13-B. A storage code. Not for a library. For a secure archive. He was halfway out the door before he'd decided what to do. By midday, he stood before the private records vault beneath the now-defunct Penmark Foundation. Having cashed in the last of his favors with the Crown Office, a few convincing lines about closing a fraud inquiry had gotten him this far. The clerk gave him a narrow look, then disappeared into the back. 15 minutes later, Whimsy was alone in a cold, silent room lined with metal drawers and reinforced cabinets. There it was, Drawer 48, Section 13. Box B, he slid it out. Inside were only two things: a small, blue velvet music box and a stack of handwritten pages bound with ribbon. The box, when opened, played a tune haunting, slow, unmistakably not a nursery melody. It was a waltz in a minor key, complex, deliberate. Eleanor's hand was on the paper. Her earlier letters had been loose, sometimes florid, but here her writing was neat, methodical, not emotional. This wasn't her diary. It was a ledger, not of finances but of names, observations, notes, the people who had been part of the Penmark web. But it didn't stop at trustees or board members. There were judges, journalists, academics, and, to his surprise, references to other families, other estates, other shadows, all tangled in a quiet network of protection and silence. This wasn't revenge. This had been a reckoning, but even more alarming, some of the dates were recent, very recent. After Lucille's death, after Maynard, after Harrow. This ledger hadn't been compiled years ago. It had been ongoing. WIMSEY single quotes S. Hands went cold. Someone else had added to this file. Someone who had access to Eleanor even after Harrow was imprisoned. Someone still working from inside. One name stood out. Underlined twice: Effrey Dunbridge, advised discretion, knows too much, watched closely. Whimsy knew that name. Professor Francis Dunbridge, an expert in information ethics and historical curation. He'd once been consulted by Eleanor's legal team after the Elgin scandal. Supposedly neutral, scholarly, but the annotations were clear. Dunbridge had been advising, not observing, and he had access to records, to families. He could reshape narratives just as Harrow had, but with even greater subtlety. Where Harrow had silenced, Dunbridge refined. There was no direct accusation, just a note at the bottom of the page. He's the one they'll turn to next. Whimsy sat back in the metal chair. He'd thought the game ended in room 17, but Eleanor had known better. She hadn't just pulled down one edifice, she'd cracked the foundation, exposing the network beneath. Harrow was the past, but the next move was already in play. He pocketed the music box and carefully returned the documents. The clerk would ask questions. He would offer the right answers. Outside, the wind had shifted again. A low mist crept between the buildings, and through it, a quiet certainty took root in Whimsy's mind. A mystery never ends. It only changes shape. As he walked back toward Piccadilly, people passed him in the mist, unaware that behind his steady stride and well-cut coat, the questions had begun again. Not who did it, but who's still playing. And why the music hadn't stopped.